The ideas presented by the knowledge of death are often explored in horror because the genre allows these hard-to-grasp concepts to be manifested in a way that makes the exploration of them a more tangible thing. While it's basically a staple of the genre, I can't think of another movie that handles this subject matter with such emotional honesty as Lake Mungo does. While the horror genre often begs the question of what happens after we die, horror fans are haunted by another question, and it's one that will continue to be asked forever because there's no way to actually answer it, similar to those questions about death. That question being, what is the scariest movie of all time? For people who often watch horror movies, getting scared isn't actually an expectation, since we've gotten so used to this stuff that it can just feel like we're past the point of being able to get scared by movies. Not to say I don't get creeped out or there aren't jump scares that get a jolt out of me, but I mean real, proper fear. I thought I would never have that same feeling I did as a kid watching horror for the first time and then being haunted by what I saw after the lights went out, and I accepted that as a part of my overindulgence. Sure, there had been movies that got under my skin or unsettled me in one way or another, but nothing that felt like it dissolved the calluses I've built up and made the fear I felt while watching something stick with me and bleed into the weeks following. Until I saw Lake Mungo.
I feel like something bad is gonna happen to me.
We'll never be able to have an objective answer for the scariest movie of all time, since fear is so subjective to your own brain chemistry and your personal life experiences. All we can really do is say what movie personally gives us that feeling of dread more than anything else could. And while I'm usually terrible at picking top spots for anything and thought I'd never be able to give one answer to that eternal question, Lake Mungo is far and away the most primal fear I have ever felt from a movie. Now, I want to be very clear that this movie utterly terrified me the first time I saw it. Well, I actually watched it twice in the same day because I was so fascinated by it, but that doesn't mean it'll necessarily elicit the same reaction for you. This movie hits a very specific nerve, and if that specific nerve isn't all that sensitive for you, then you might hear me call this the scariest movie I've ever seen, and then go into it with those expectations, only to walk away disappointed. I've recommended this movie to a number of people, and only one other person has had the same visceral reaction that I did, and that was my brother, so do with that what you will. It's also worth noting that Mike Flanagan himself gave an absolutely glowing review of this movie on Letterboxd that lines up pretty much perfectly with my thoughts on it, and he seemed to have that same visceral reaction that we did, going so far as to call it one of the greatest independent films ever made, and also featuring one of the most terrifying shots in horror history, while also acknowledging the beauty in the story. Here's something I want to make very clear up front. This isn't a movie that's guaranteed to scare you. Its approach to horror is very slow and indirect, with a lot of the fear I felt from it coming from certain ideas presented by the movie's narrative. It's a subtle, quiet, slow burn movie that never gets big and crazy and doesn't deliver the traditional scary movie experience that many will expect from something that somebody calls the scariest movie they've ever seen. I just don't want to create the wrong expectations for people, since I think Lake Mungo has so much to offer outside of the fear factor in the way it tells this haunting, tragic, and beautiful melancholic story about grief and acceptance, and I don't want to rob anyone of enjoying those elements by setting the wrong expectations and pointing their focus in the wrong direction. This is a movie that's best seen knowing as little as possible, and while that's true for pretty much every story in my opinion, Lake Mungo offers such a unique experience that I would urge you to go and watch it for yourself without continuing this video or doing any more research into it. If you know nothing, that's the perfect stage, and you should give yourself that experience untainted by preconceived notions or prior knowledge to the events and ideas in the film. It's a one-of-a-kind experience, and if there's even a sliver of a chance that you'll have the same reaction that my brother and I or Mike Flanagan did, I would hate to rob you of that. Aside from being a deeply frightening movie, I found myself entranced by its story and characters in such a way that rewatching it over and over again continues to be both rewarding and satisfying, as the movie has morphed from a dread-inducing watch that dried out my throat and made me stumble over my words out of nervousness even trying to talk about it to people in the month following my first exposure to it, to now being a mystical exploration of the fog that comes after a sudden loss and the questions that something like that forces us to ask. It's an incredibly deep and utterly fascinating story that has stuck with me in a way that is wholly unique to it, and I finally decided to tackle it after putting it off for so long because I just didn't know if I could find the proper words that would do justice to a movie that had such a profound effect on me. I am sorry it's taken me this long into the video to actually start talking about the movie itself, but if I was going to make this video at all, I had to make sure I was doing it on my terms and with the proper setup so that I can feel satisfied with it. Otherwise, this would just never get made since I wouldn't feel happy with another approach. This is one of 2 videos I've put off out of intimidation, the other one being Mike Flanagan's Haunting of Hill House, so maybe doing this will finally start to open me up a little bit more to what would inevitably be a colossal project. For now, let's dive into what is, for me, the scariest movie ever made. Lake Mungo presents a very simple base for its story. It opens on still images of supposed ghost sightings while snippets of dialogue from later in the film bring up some of the core ideas of the story.
Alice kept secrets. Kept the fact she kept secrets a secret.
We'll learn more about the context of these quotes, but for now they're these floating statements and questions that are meant to resonate in the back of your head while you watch the movie. It's quite a chilling way of introducing this story that dovetails into the film with an image of the central Palmer family, which is tied into the visuals in that opening sequence in a deeply unsettling way, but we'll come back to that later on. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking about the setup for the story here. We learn right away that this family has suffered a terrible tragedy, that being the loss of their daughter Alice, who drowned during a family day out at a lake. Not Lake Mungo, by the way, that doesn't come up until much later on. The movie is presented as a documentary, telling its story through talking head interviews and found footage elements while various people connected to Alice's life recount things that they remember leading up to her death, as well as the strange things that happened afterwards. It's a unique way to tell a story because we never actually experience things as the characters do, we're simply watching them recount these events, which is a really interesting angle to take because it allows for them to share their aged perspectives on what happened as opposed to their immediate reactions. The timeline that we're being told about takes place over the course of at least a year and a half, likely longer than that by a few months at the very least, which means that we see these people after having settled into their perceptions of these events and coming to their own conclusions about different things after all the time spent pondering what happened. On the very surface, the events that are recounted are nothing at all unique when it comes to horror. We have someone who died, and then following their death, the people around them were subject to strange occurrences that they couldn't explain. And in some ways, there isn't anything else to it, but what makes Lake Mungo such an interesting take on this very saturated premise is the way in which information is unveiled and drip-fed through the discoveries made by Alice's family members. It's the presentation of this story and the revelations about secrets Alice was keeping or strange behaviors from those in her life that make the film so intriguing, but it's also the complete and total commitment to immersion that makes it so effective. Found footage and mockumentary horror films became very popular for 2 main reasons. One is that they can be made for incredibly cheap and have historically had very good returns on those shoestring budgets. The second reason is that presenting your story through supposedly real ghost footage can go a long way in grounding the story more and raising the fear factor because it feels more real. The thing is though, many of these movies still show things that are very hard to sell as real footage because it's oftentimes hard to explain why people would be filming these things, but also just because watching Mika get thrown up the stairs and then having Katie charge at the camera with a transformed demon face isn't exactly the most believable thing, even if it's impactful as a movie. This kind of thing can be fun, but I feel like it can often waste a lot of the potential in found footage horror because if you don't show things like these and commit to presenting the story as something real, it can result in the viewer completely forgetting that what they're watching didn't actually happen. Lake Mungo avoids both of these pitfalls by having people talk about events instead of shoehorning in weird reasons for them to have filmed them, but also because it never shows anything that's theatrical enough to kill the immersion or the realism. There are images in the movie where we see things that are supernatural, but they're shown in such a subdued and grounded way that it really does just wind up feeling like you're looking at real life images that you can't find an explanation for. It's the only only movie I've seen where every single time I watch it, I wind up having to remind myself that it's not real because of how immersed I get, and that's the main reason that I find this film so deeply terrifying. Everything about this feels genuine, and there is so much restraint employed for the sake of that realism. A lot of that comes from the fascinating characters and the incredible performances from the entire cast. Grief, it's a weird thing, and there's no way to know ahead of time how you're going to react to it, and Lake Mungo shows a lot of really interesting examples of how the different people in Alice's life behaved following her death. Russell, Alice's father, seems to have gone down the traditional masculine approach of just diving deeply into his work and going on about his daily life, trying to hold on to some sense of normalcy and not let his boundaries down too much. During his interview sections, he's fairly closed off about certain questions, and his answers to others reveal that part of the way he's dealt with some of the tougher revelations is by coming to conclusions for himself that are less painful than what the reality likely was. The main one is a conclusion that he draws at the end of the movie that I'll talk about later. He's my favorite character in the movie, despite his reservations, because the way that characters are portrayed have a lot of nuance to them, and he's not just completely closed off and against talking about things. If that were the case, it would make no sense that he'd be willing to be a part of the documentary in the first place, and you can tell that he does want to let some of this out. The moments where he opens up and lets his guard down some are some of the most emotionally potent scenes, like when he's asked about why they still leave the porch light on after all this time.
Just in case she comes home, I guess.
It's those honest depictions of the strangeness of grief that I find so much more engaging about this movie than many others where grieving characters are just shown as crying and sad the entire time, which isn't a dishonest portrayal of grief by any means, but I find these little details and their behaviors a lot more interesting and relatable for me personally. It's those smaller parts of everyday life that get highlighted in the absence of someone, like for example, how I had to remind myself to lock the back door every night after my dad died because he was always the one who would do that. This movie is full of those types of details, and I find that to be a really interesting angle of exploration for a story centered around this kind of thing. The film also sets up the immediate onset of grief in an incredibly effective way by having Russell explain that after identifying Alice's body a few days after she went missing, the car stalled and he could only get it into reverse after that, so they drove all the way back home in reverse, showing how their world was flipped around and broken up on this day. This isn't footage of the actual night, of course, just a recreation of it as there were no cameras around at the time. Matthew, Alice's brother, seemed to have the strangest reaction to the loss of his sister, and there have been a lot of theories about him, the main one being that he actually killed Alice. To be fair, I can see why a lot of people have come to that conclusion, because he does seem to show a strange fascination with death, as we can see by some of his photography work. He was very close with Alice and was the last person to see her before she went missing. He had bruises appear on his body a while after her death, which indicated to some that her spirit was trying to somehow get back at him. There is certainly a lot that can be seen that would point to that being the case, but I don't personally subscribe to that idea. I just don't think it fits with the nature of the story, and I instead believe that the fixation he has on Alice's spirit and his curiosity about death was actually just the result of him grappling with the sudden slap in the face of losing a loved one at a young age, especially his sister. Losing someone close to you can cause you to fixate on death and try and find some sort of meaning in it, so I don't find it strange that he had pictures like this. The bruises I see is just something strange that's meant to sort of be up in the air, because it could have just been some strange medical phenomena that was included in the documentary since it was never explained. And I think having that sort of thing present in the movie adds a lot of authenticity to its presentation. Very anecdotally, I also remember reading somewhere about someone who worked on the movie responding to this theory and saying that it wasn't true, but I can't remember where that was, and it was a while ago, so take that with a grain of salt. At the end of the day though, I also just don't like the theory because it completely changes the whole vibe of the movie to me in a way that I don't like nearly as much, so there's that too. I think the whole thing is vague enough that it can't really be said one way or another, but I don't think Matthew was responsible for Alice's death. Aside from all of that, his character is a huge focal point of the first half of the movie. He got really into photography, and something that began to happen soon after was that these eerie images of Alice began showing up in some of his photographs. Now, while there's more to them than we know at first, the impact that these photos have when they're first shown is one of the most viscerally uncomfortable things any movie has ever made me feel, because They don't feel like horror movie portrayals of ghosts caught on camera, but instead like real, unexplainable pictures that supposedly show spirits. Joel Anderson, the director of this film, did such an amazing job at making me tense up by showing these pictures, not always having it be immediately clear what I was supposed to be looking at in the frame, and then slowly zooming in on the subject. I'd then realize what was being shown, get really creeped out by it, and then it would just continue to zoom further and further while the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and my fight or flight instinct goes into overdrive. It happens a lot. And despite there being no motion in these images or showing anything even clearly frightening, the realistic context they're shown in, the blurry and hazy look of the film, and the ridiculously effective and subtle soundscape all combine to make these so deeply unsettling. These completely simple and quiet images frighten me more than 95% of entire horror movies I've sat through because of how well they're presented, all of it being elevated by the fact that I always fucking forget that I'm watching a fictional movie once I get sucked in by its premise. Some of these are made to be flat out terrifying when they're shown again in the closing credits, but I'm gonna save that for the end. While these images are initially deeply unsettling, it is revealed that Matthew has been doctoring them by adding Alice into the frame, which he says he did to try and give his family some hope that maybe she was still out there in some way. June, not having the closure of seeing Alice's body after it was recovered from the lake like Russell did, became convinced after seeing these pictures that Alice was still somehow alive, and it's clear during her interview that she was very upset by what Matthew did, and rightfully so. I also think that she offers a more realistic insight into his motivations with the doctoring.
I'm just not convinced that he really knows why he did it.
He may have explained it in a way that would sound the most palatable out loud, but I think June is probably right in that this was just an unexplainable coping mechanism that not even Matthew himself can fully grasp. June is the most emotionally open during her interviews, and once again, she's an example of how realistic the depiction of grief in this movie is, with the standout scene for me being when she's reading a diary entry from before Alice's death.
Everything felt wrong. My body, the way things looked.
There is nothing in this scene that feels like an actor giving a performance. This is just full stop a mother reading something very unnerving from the diary of her late daughter and trying to grapple with that. She too had a bit of a strange way of coping for a while, where she would wander into people's homes in the middle of the night to try and feel like she was living in a different life. For a while, the movie is essentially segmented into these looks at how each person in Alice's life dealt with her death, including interviews from one of her friends or others who knew her boyfriend, other family members like her grandparents, or other locals who may have captured things relevant to what happened. Like this image that was at first interpreted as Alice herself standing by the lake, but was later revealed to be Matthew wandering the area where his sister had died. It's not just an analysis of what grief looks like, it's also an exploration of that feeling of discovering secrets that have been kept by the person who died that had never been revealed while they were alive. Matthew's doctored images are relevant for a few reasons, and one of those is that within one of them, we can see another figure off in a different room, who June recognizes as being their neighbor, raising a million questions in a fraction of a second. This is one of the narrative elements within Lake Mungo that is extremely difficult to sit through, but not for any supernatural reasons. Alice's room is searched, and hidden away is a box full of things she wanted kept secret, one of those being a VHS tape containing incredibly disturbing footage. Alice had babysat for the Tuohys for a while now, but this footage reveals something horrifying about their relationship. The footage shows Alice having sex with Brett and Marissa Tuohy, the parents of the kids she was babysitting, which is why Brett was seen in her room on that night. He was there trying to track down the tape, knowing that Alice's room would be thoroughly rummaged through after her death and not wanting the VHS to be discovered, but he was unable to find it. While it's a really tough section of the movie, it's also one of the most important elements to making it work as well as it does as that exploration of grief, introducing the fact that Alice had a completely different side to her that no one else in her life seemed to be aware of. This tape doesn't depict anything non-consensual, but obviously with Alice being 16 at the time of her death, there is absolutely nothing okay about this. The thing is though, there's no closure given to this subplot at all, because after being unable to find the tape, the Tuohys moved away and have not been tracked down since they left. They knew what was coming, so they packed up their lives and ran. Alice is gone, they're not around to give any information about this, so it winds up being this discovery floating up in the air that's made about Alice raising questions about what else she was hiding that will never be known. These sorts of discoveries can completely change the way you see someone, not just because of the nature of what's learned, but also because of the fact that it was kept hidden, calling into question how well you really knew the person and if you could ever trust them in the way you thought you could. Sometimes things come out about people after they died, and they're not around to explain themselves, which is part of the tragedy in and of itself. And we see how that lack of closure and opening of Pandora's box punched a new hole in the hearts of this already devastated family. It's a great example of how Lake Mungo shows its restraint in giving information for the sake of believability, where many movies would find a way to show us what happened between Alice and the Tuohys. This movie understands that in this situation, there is genuinely no way that more information can be found, and so we're left without answers. With all that being said, I think it's about time we get into the big question at the heart of Lake Mungo. What actually happened to Alice? Now, to be clear, I won't be getting into too much theorizing about the specifics of events that aren't made clear in the movie, because a huge part of the appeal that it has is the sense of eerie mystery and the unknowable. But there are certain elements here that aren't strictly spelled out by the characters that I find absolutely fascinating. One of the things that continues to draw me in with the film is the strange haziness in regards to the timeline of events, where whatever was going on in Alice's world leading up to her death seemed to not abide by the linearity of time that we do. This is of course present in the film's finale, but there are other moments where time seems to have been muddled in really interesting ways. One of those comes in footage from Matthew's camera, where we see him sneaking up on Alice while she's in her room. She chases him out, and that may make you recall something from earlier on, the answer to which is the first instance of this strange phenomena with time. During one of Russell's interviews, he recounts an experience he had where he walked into Alice's room after her death and explains exactly what we see unfold between her and Matthew, making it seem as if Russell saw some sort of remnant left behind from that interaction they had, replaying in reality like it forgot it was only supposed to happen once. We see similar things happen 2 more times, the first of which being an entry in Alice's diary talking about this eerie liminal experience she had, where she had a dream about standing frozen by her parents' bed, and when she woke up, she was frightened and tried to walk to their room. She felt like she'd been drugged, was all confused and found it hard to move, and then as she stood by their bed, she was overcome by fear and sadness, feeling like she was out somewhere all alone despite her parents being right there in front of her. Once again, this ties back to something we learned about earlier on. We had seen footage from a camera that had been set up inside the house, and on it, we see Alice standing there frozen by her parents' bed in the middle of the night long after her death. So again, we're seeing the lines of reality and time becoming blurred and muddled, with Alice seemingly knowing for whatever reason that whatever was going to happen to her was going to leave her on her own, without the warmth of her parents' comfort. The third instance of this kind of thing, aside from the film's finale, is something that I want to save for a minute, because I think it's an important thing to mention once we have the full context. From that diary entry, we learn that Alice's death seemed to have been setting into her reality in strange ways for a while before it actually happened, and that brings us to the scene that has scared me more than any other sequence of any horror movie has in my adult life. This brings us to Lake Mungo. The discovery of Alice's phone far off in Lake Mungo shows footage that she recorded on it the night it was buried. There's another character that I haven't mentioned yet, that being Ray, a supposed psychic who was consulted about Alice's death and wound up becoming somewhat close with the family. If there was any one thing about Lake Mungo that would risk breaking the immersion, it would have been having Ray do some wild psychic things to amp up the third act, but once again, there was a lot of restraint employed for the sake of immersion with this character. We never see Ray tell the future or conjure ghosts or have Alice speak through his mouth, but he instead is shown as someone who tries to bring comfort to people facing death by providing them with some hope that it's not the end. He doesn't do anything that pushes past the point of believability, and I love what his character brings to the story through this outside perspective. It's not known until later on, but Alice had actually gone to him prior to her death with these feelings of impending doom that she was grappling with. We hear some of her consultation with Ray as this footage recovered from her cell phone is shown to us. You could show me the first frame of this footage and my throat will dry up immediately. That's how hard this sequence hits me. The footage shows Alice walking by herself out in Lake Mungo after straying from the group she was with, and In the grainy footage and inky blackness of night, there's something off in the distance that seems to be there. We can't tell what it is yet. It's nothing more than a few gray pixels in this dark nightmare, but as Alice's description of this looming feeling she's been having continues and we get closer, it becomes more clear that we're looking at a figure of someone. By this point, my heart rate is through the roof. My hands are sweating and my chest is tightened up. Once Alice gets close enough for a proper look of whatever this is, we see that it's Alice's waterlogged corpse just standing out here in the middle of nowhere. Not moving, not doing anything, just standing there. This, for me, is the single most terrifying shot in any horror movie, and it's the only time as an adult that I've had an image haunt me long after the movie ended. I remember one night having to shut the blinds after it got dark because I'd psyched myself up so much thinking about this image, and even to this day, when I see it, I feel so uneasy. Hell, even just talking about it now is making me kind of tense up a little bit. It's not just the shot itself, but the context of what it is we're actually looking at and when it was seen. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, and wandering off on your own only to come face to face with your own ghost is one of the most bone-chilling concepts I have ever heard. And while this isn't the only story to do something like this, it's the way it's done here specifically that makes it hit me with so much force. While Matthew's images of Alice had been debunked, there were some that came up later on that could not have been set up by him because he was away on a road trip when they were taken and reviewed. So the Palmers had already been exposed to the idea of Alice's ghost, but this footage on her phone is the final piece that they felt they were missing. To top this horrifying sequence off, we have one of the most effective and well-earned jump scares I've ever seen that literally made my brother and I yell when we watched this together, and I had already seen the movie earlier that same day, so that should tell you a lot.
It was Ellie's body and Ellie's face.
And that's the climax of the movie. There's no big blowout, no spectacle moment where things are flying around the room or people are hearing demon voices. The climax of Lake Mungo is a quiet image of a baffling vision standing out in the middle of nowhere in pitch black, and then the movie winds down. The Palmers felt that after finding this footage and realizing that Alice had seen her impending death coming for her before it was there, they began to move on with their lives.
The house felt different. It was, calm.
I mean, what are you supposed to do with that information? How do you carry on about your life knowing this? In regards to what I was talking about earlier with Russell having an idea of something that ties into the end of the movie, he doesn't believe that Alice knew this was her ghost. He doesn't give an explanation as to why that is, so to me, it seems like this is just him trying to convince himself that she didn't know, because the thought of his child spending the last months of her life knowing that she was going to die is too much for him to handle. I'd imagine there's some solace in having something this clear telling you that you really can't try and grasp whatever happened to Alice, so it may be easier to just accept that and try and make the most of whatever's left of your understanding of reality. So what is it that makes this such a terrifying film to me? It's just a compilation of people recalling different events and some creepy images of a ghost. But it's really not. The movie adds up to so much more than the sum of its parts because of how much you're asked to engage with the world and involve yourself in the questions the characters themselves have, meaning that even once the credits roll, I'm still left pondering what the hell happened over the course of this timeline. It's seeped into my everyday life in a way that nothing has in a long time, but it's also the sheer believability of the presentation that makes it so horrifying in the moment of watching it. It's like a strange memory that I forgot I had, and there's something so candid about the way this all unfolded that makes it by far the scariest movie I've ever watched. Now, it's not as simple as the Palmers moving on with whatever acceptance they've each been able to find, because there's one more revelation at the end that closes it off on such an eerie note. We see June's final consultation with Ray, where he takes her through a meditation and she begins describing walking through her house. She talks about entering Alice's room, looking around for her, but finding it completely empty before she turns and leaves. The thing is, Alice did this same thing with Ray and describes sitting in her room by herself and seeing her mother walk in, and here's what Alice has to say about it.
I don't think she knows I'm there.
All of the strange happenings in the timeline of events before were premonitions of things that hadn't happened yet, or these ghostly memories left behind. What happens with this interaction is one of the most compelling things I've ever heard in a movie, and Ray's face shows that he too is picking up on what happened here. Alice and June somehow shared the same vision in their meditation over a year apart, with Alice sitting in the room wanting nothing more than to be seen by her mother, but she doesn't get that. June thinks that Alice is not there, and she leaves, and Alice is left sitting in the gray, all on her own in this strange dreamscape. It seems that the Palmers feel they're moving on from all of this, and as they leave the house, we see the photo of them from the start of the movie, and standing in the window is the vague shape of Alice, watching as they go, and she's left alone in the dark. This theme of Alice being unseen and lonesome in her death is emphasized in what is far and away the most bone-chilling closing credits sequence I have ever witnessed, where we revisit images and footage from earlier on in the movie and are shown that Alice was actually in a number of them, whether we noticed her there or not. My two favorites of these are the April 28th photo of the backyard and the birthday footage. The first is because of how great of a misdirect this image is, where we were drawn to the doctored sight of Alice standing in the yard, and then once we learn what Matthew did, we leave it behind. But Alice was in the photo after all, standing off to the side, not even hidden. She's just there, and we didn't notice her because we were drawn to the other image. The birthday footage is just flat out terrifying, not just because of how eerie this realization that she was standing in the hallway is, but also because, and I'm not sure if I'm seeing this wrong, it looks like she's got blood running down her face and a horrified expression, which is completely uncharacteristic of the rest of the film. None of the other images of her show anything like that, so this having a far more brutal look raises even more questions about the nature of where Alice is, and also throws into question how the Palmers view where they left things off. Alice's reality seems far more bleak than even they realized, but then again, dark secrets are nothing new for her. The realization that so much of the core of the movie was about her feeling alone and unseen leading up to her death, and then feeling that more after she died, is so much more terrifying when you realize that you were a part of it too. She was there and was also unseen by us. That recontextualization of what we thought we knew about the story is such an interesting way to close off the movie, calling into question everything that we just sat through. I love the idea of ending your story by completely changing how you see it and leaving you with all new questions to ponder. Now, I also need to talk about one of the most important elements of this movie, and that's the score. It's incredibly simple and subdued, with a lot of droning, fuzzy tones making up the soundscape, but there are a few repeating motifs that go such a long way at creating the film's tone. David Patterson composed the original score and delivered a bone-chilling soundscape that perfectly evokes the sound of the strange liminal space that the last few months of Alice's life were, and a piece called Rostro by Mexican abstract composer Murkov, whose simple piano and fuzzy haze serves a similar purpose to Patterson's music while also reflecting the eerie tragedy of the film. In all honesty, through writing this video and sitting here recording it now, I think I realized that I can't fully articulate what it is about Lake Mungo that makes it so compelling to me. The best I feel like I can do is this. That's the most accurate depiction of what this movie is to me, and I have no idea if that's going to make sense. I'm drawn to liminal spaces and uncanny images. I'm drawn to sad ghost stories that use ghosts to explore concepts that are very difficult to grasp, and I enjoy stories where there's something going on that I simply can't fully understand, and Lake Mungo has all of this. It's a tragic, thought-provoking, and beautiful film about loss that also happens to be the most terrifying movie I've ever sat through, and still, to this day, if I sit down on my own in the dark and watch this, there's just something so unique about it.
I think that Alice wanted us to know more about her.
Nothing leaves me feeling the way I do when I finish watching this movie, and I found it endlessly rewatchable because of how much more nuance in the characters I pick up on every time, turning from being just a terrifying watch to an equally compelling one from an emotional perspective. I've had a lot of loss of people close to me in my life, and I'm no stranger to grief, which is probably part of the reason that I connect with this movie so much, but This is the kind of thing that has scared me my entire life. Eerie, candid, and liminal images with fuzzy soundscapes and an unknowable quality. Lake Mungo is a masterpiece in my eyes, but that word almost feels degrading to it because it doesn't feel like I'm watching something made by a storyteller. This is just a documentary about something that never happened.